Forearmed is forewarned. What do I know about guns, really? I'm a post-hippie liberal pacifist from the Long Island suburbs where if somebody had a gun, they kept very quiet about it. Until yesterday, I had never held a gun, never mind fired one. I've not been any closer to a gun being fired than at a high school track meet. Even when we moved to Boston a few years back, where we assumed there were guns, I was pretty sure that there were only two kinds of people with guns, the cops and the bad guys, and since all of our windows had bars on them, there seemed to be little cause for concern. If we were to hear a loud noise upstairs during the night, it could only be our two cats knocking something off of a counter, or maybe a poltergeist. So we slept soundly, even as there were bullets flying somewhere in Boston every night of the year. But we spent most of our time at our home up in rural New Hampshire. To a guy like me who came from fenced-in yards, barely big enough for a picnic table and a patio, this is the wilderness. Up here, everyone wants to live free or die, something I might wish to qualify and temper a bit, despite what is proclaimed on my new license plate. Up here, one might feel embarrassed to admit one does not have a firearm in the house. We went over to the Hopkinton State Fair last year and saw an exhibit by the New Hampshire Fish and Game Department. They had all kinds of preserved animals, and I don't mean teddy bears. There was a real bear, fully reared up and flashing claws as long as steak knives. There was a bobcat and a thing called a fisher cat, something I had never heard of before, an apparently bloodthirsty cross between an otter and a chainsaw, with rows of what looked like 100 teeth, all bared for us to consider. Even the raccoon and beaver looked like they could take down a German shepherd. I won't even mention the moose, which was, with some surprise to me, as big as a moose. Even at my height of 6 feet 5 inches, that moose was nearly too tall for me to reach up and rub his chin. I said to the nice ranger in the green uniform, "Do you mean we have these things in this state?" "Oh, yes," he assured me. "These were all caught in this vicinity." At home that night, I found that suddenly the darkness had taken on new and terrifying proportions. I began to lie in bed and try to decide just what I would do if a bear decided to come through the French door in our bedroom. What if I were confronted by a moose or fisher cat as I went to get firewood or barbecue a steak? Did I want to stand between a famished bobcat and a perfectly grilled sirloin or pork chop? I won't bore you with all the stories I've been told about fisher cats stealing off with small dogs after smashing through a window screen, or bears swiping roasts right off kitchen counters. And clearly, screaming would do not a whit of good. Isolated as we are in the woods, I would be left with no alternative but to wet my pants and pray. People up here in New Hampshire spend no time at all worrying about such things. They have guns handy at all times and loaded for bear or anything else for that matter. But I've come to understand that there seems to be a more important reason to have a gun, that being to protect oneself from the most dangerous animal in the forest, other people, or worse, other people from Massachusetts. There surely are some bad guys in both places, and they have bad intentions. Some of them will break into your house looking for your wife or your stuff. And what if a bad guy breaks in during the night? What would I plan to do? Chase him out of the house with a hairdryer? Call the police? Our little town has but a single police officer. If he happens to be awake and on duty, he might well be a 20-minute drive away. By the time he got here, the bad guy could be halfway to Montreal, and I could be halfway into rigor mortis. So I have crossed over to the dark side, or perhaps I am now prepared to keep the dark side from crossing over to me. Yesterday we bought a short-barrel, pump-action 12-gauge shotgun. It was not so complicated once we finished deliberating for 2 years. We took a ride to the Kittery Trading Post over in Maine, a place which is a virtual, no, make that an actual heaven for anyone who wants to do anything outdoors. If I had any misgivings about what we were about to do, they were allayed by the fact that they had the place adorned with stuffed animals of every sort. including an enormous bull moose near the entrance, which put me in mind of the first time I went to the Museum of Natural History in New York City and was greeted by a life-size Tyrannosaurus Rex. We went to the gun department, which was enormous and had enough firepower displayed to have fought and won the Second World War. We approached a nice fellow who was behind the counter and asked for some help. I began by confessing that, although my wife had been around guns in her Minnesota farm youth, I was a child of the 60s, raised on Long Island, who might have chuckled at the need for a Second Amendment in our Constitution, and who had applauded at the end of bowling for Columbine. We told him that we were somewhat new residents of New Hampshire and thought we might like a little something for self-defense. He gamely walked down the length of racks and brought us to a rack of shotguns marked self-defense weapons. He first asked if we wanted a 12-gauge or a 20-gauge. I scoffed at the need for a 20-gauge and told him that the 12-gauge should be more than adequate. This made him cock his head at an odd angle, the reason for which I was only to understand some months later. He then presented us with a positively frightening all-black thing, and after snapping the bump forward and back once, told us that this might be our best choice, because most bad guys would retreat at just the sound of that pump action, and we would not have to actually shoot anyone. This was not the first time we had heard such pronouncement in New Hampshire. Everyone here apparently knows that sound, much like people from Long Island know the sound of an electric garage door opening or a pool filter clicking on. He then began to act out a scenario for us to show just how easy it would be to blast someone to kingdom come with this particular implement, saying things like, let's say a bad guy shows up in your bedroom in the middle of the night. You take your shotgun, etc., and so on, at the end of which I asked politely, might we assume that the bad guy would have been killed at this point? To which he replied with a smile, yup, very killed. He then added that if you decide that someone might kill you, there is no point in wondering about the necessity of getting off a second blast. Who could quibble with that? So we said, wrap it up. We'd take the thing. The purchase process began with my having to fill out a form so they could do a background check on me, since I would be the designated as the shotgun's owner. They asked me questions like, are you a fugitive from justice? And have you ever been convicted of a crime which involved the use of a weapon? And have you ever been incarcerated for stalking someone? I could not help but wonder to myself if they really believed that someone who had done anything like that would answer honestly. They might have added a question about one's level of resolve for truthfulness. But one does not want to start this process with a wisecrack. Needless to say, I passed with flying colors and we got a chance to plunk down $400 for the gun and a box of ammo. Beside the register was a display sporting, of all things, chocolate truffles. I asked an apparently humorless cashier if it would be considered generally polite to offer a few sweets to someone before you blew a hole in them. She smiled and said she would not recommend it. So we left feeling, well, empowered and maybe even invincible, and boasted to one another about our self-control and not buying the truffles. I thought quietly to myself how much I really hoped that I would never have to actually fire that thing. That did not last long. When we got home and called our neighbor friend David to tell him the big news, he said that we had better come over right away, and he would make sure we knew how to handle our new shotgun. I asked if we should bring the birdshot they sold us to stop the bad guy with. He said, birdshot? Will you be planning to kill the bad guy or just piss him off so that he kills you and then carves you up, or worse, carves first? Don't you remember how Dick Cheney shot his friend in the face with birdshot and he barely needed medical attention? I had not remembered that at the time of our purchase. I asked him where we needed to go to shoot the shotgun. He said, this is New Hampshire. We can shoot it anywhere we damn well please. So off we went, down the road, a few steps into the woods, where he gave us a good talking to about gun etiquette and gun safety and how birdshot is for killing birds. After that, he fired the first shots with our brand new gun, and I was amazed at just how loud it was. But that fact became less impressive after I stepped up and fired the thing and nearly landed on my butt from the recoil. The thought crossed my wife's mind that if we were confronting a bad guy in our house in the dark, we might not be taking sturdy aim, but rather shooting from the hip, as they say. She likes police shows. I decided to try that technique and was impressed at just how fast my knuckles turned black and blue from the violent kick of the shot. As I undressed for bed that evening, I was further impressed at the size of the matching bruise on my shoulder. Beyond that, today I still have a defined ringing in my ears and wonder if, forced to fire this cannon inside my house, my penance for having killed some bad guy would be profound, irreversible deafness. I may have to add to my list of self-defense maneuvers that I practice putting on noise-canceling earmuffs before firing at anyone. Beyond that was a serious and thoughtful reflection on my relationship with my wife, by considering if I was capable of doing something which might inspire her to resort to violence. I decided that was too grim a subject and firmly announced that I would be standing the shotgun on my side of the bed. I suppose I will have to now consider, falling peacefully and confidently to my slumber, I might have been better off with a burglar alarm and a can of Fisher Cat repellent. Do they make Fisher Cat repellent? Oh well, back up to Kittery, first thing tomorrow.